Time now for a look through today's newspapers. For that, we're joined by Alison Sargent. And Alison, we're going to start with a look at the situation in Mali, where a group of soldiers have detained the Prime Minister and the interim president as well.
Yeah, Mali has been plunged back into political chaos. That's according to local paper, the Journal du Mali. The paper notes that the interim president and prime minister have been taken to the very same military complex that the former President Boubacar Keïta was taken to last August before he announced his resignation. Some 9 months after what was a military coup, quote, the military is stepping their boots into the transition. That's according to Le Pays, which is a paper from neighboring Burkina Faso. The paper writes that this situation does look like bad news for Mali, and other papers from Burkina Faso are also expressing their concerns. Wakat Sera, another paper, wonders if Mali is going to get stuck in an endless cycle of military coups. And another paper, L'Observateur Palga, is asking, is the military hopeless? They write that it's regrettable to see all of these soldiers fighting over privileges and scraps of the Republic, while Mali, the people of Mali, are being left to, quote, terrorist hordes and eaten away by sectarian conflict.
Indignation, meanwhile, here in Europe after Belarus forced the landing of that commercial plane to arrest an opposition figure.
Yeah, Belgian paper Le Soir calls it a violation of freedom in European skies that cannot go unpunished, and it is not going unpunished. Europe has taken action to block EU airspace and airports to Belarus. Now, in this editorial, Le Soir writes that until now, the Belarus problem had really just been that. It had remained Belarus's problem. The EU was worried about getting too involved and sending the country, quote, further into the arms of Vladimir Putin. But after what they're calling this hostage taking, quote, Europe can no longer act with distance and precaution. Now, meanwhile, German paper Der Tagesspiegel points out that this attitude of Europe is somewhat hypocritical. The paper writes that while Europe is justified in their indignation, they ask, quote, did it really take an airplane hijacking for Europe to take an interest in the brutal repression of the democratic movement in Belarus? Der Tagesspiegel concludes that Europe still hasn't really found a way to deal with what they call the autocrats of Moscow and Minsk, and that's exactly, the paper says, why Lukashenko was able to do what he did.
Going to change topics now. Another of today's story. This Tuesday marks the 1-year anniversary of the police killing of George Floyd. Lots of tributes, Alison, to him.
Lots of tributes because, of course, his killing sparked a reckoning over race, not only in the United States, but also around the world. We can take a look at the front page of The Independent over in the UK. They're marking the anniversary of his death with this illustrated front page, George Floyd, a year of protest. Now, over in Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd was killed, the Star Tribune is taking a look at some of the symbolic changes that have been made since his death. Things like NASCAR banning Confederate flags, brands removing racial stereotypes from their marketing campaigns, The Simpsons cartoon saying that white characters are no longer going to be voicing non-white characters. So it's an interesting list that really does give you a sense of this broader cultural change, but it is far from the sweeping police reform, which is really what people have been calling for. As French paper L'Humanité notes, the politicians in Washington still haven't managed to agree on a national legislation on police reform. The paper notes that actually in many cities, like Minneapolis, the pandemic actually saw increased crime rates, which in some cases have led to increased calls to actually fund rather than defund the police.
Finally, you have another article to end on, and it's still on the topic of crime, but a much lighter and very different story. It's about a drug dealer in the United Kingdom who, well, basically was caught because of his love of blue cheese.
That's right. Police were able to identify him after he shared a photo of a wedge of Stilton cheese. As website The Verge explains, he made two major mistakes. First, he shared the photo that you see here on EncroChat, which is a messaging system apparently used by organized crime rings. So if you haven't heard of it, perhaps that's why you're not in the mafia. Anyway, it was compromised by police last year, and they have been finding tons of people from this app. Second, he showed, if you look at the photo, he showed just enough of his hand for them to actually identify his fingerprints from the photo and use them to identify him, which I did not realize you could do from a photo.
No, that's pretty impressive, because I was immediately looking for, I think there was a story recently about somebody who had a tattoo on their hands.
Yeah, no, we did one recently about like a defining tattoo, people who show their faces. This guy seemed to do an okay job, but fingers.
The things we learn with you, Alison Sargent. Thanks a lot for that look at the international papers. It is time for us to take a quick break.